Good afternoon, viewers. Welcome to this series of lectures on European history. I am Shankar Kumar. I teach history at Hindu College in University of Delhi, and the topic that we would be talking about today relates to the movement of Reformation in Europe. And as you know, this was around the 16th century in Europe. And in this particular interaction of half an hour or so, we would specifically be talking about the contributions and role of Martin Luther. And as you all know, or students of history specifically would know, that Martin Luther was active in areas what today is Germany, and he was one of the earliest to begin talking about the need to reform. He was declared a heretic, was put to all kinds of restrictions, and despite that, he was a rebel to the core and went on to further the cause of reforming the Catholic Church in Europe. And he was popular in some parts of Germany, particularly the northern cities of Germany. We will do the sociology of his popularity, and also we will talk about the theological aspects that underpinned his ideas about reforms or Reformation, and we shall also see the political trappings or social trappings of what he was doing and how he was received by the then existent princes of Germany and so forth, the attitude of the ruling class towards him and so forth. But before we begin talking about Luther, let's do a little bit of some kind of preliminaries of this term Protestant itself. And this is interesting, that the term Protestant comes not because Martin Luther protested against some of the abuses and bad practices that had crept in the Catholic Church by around 16th century, but because of something else, and that is what we will see. Now, before 1529, 1520 is the time when we start seeing Luther's impact being felt, and Luther is very active in terms of doing several things, defiance and so forth, and his indictment, his getting branded as a heretic or declared as heretic and so forth. So, before 1529, if you look at the contemporary literature of Europe, you don't find this term Protestantism to typify any and every effort to reform Catholic Church. So, the term that was used was evangelical, and it is through this word evangelical that all the earlier reforming impulses or factions at Wittenberg and elsewhere in France and Switzerland were understood. So, all earlier efforts to reform Catholic Church were understood as evangelical and not as Protestant. But with the entry of Martin Luther, it acquired an identity of its own, and this is because in February 1529, the Diet of Speyer, Diet would be some kind of a representative parliamentary kind of a system of various princes in Germany. So, the Diet of Speyer voted to end the toleration of Lutheranism in Germany. So far, whatever Martin Luther was doing with reference to criticizing or offering bitter critique of Catholic Church, Germany was somewhat tolerating it. But in February 29, the Diet of Speyer voted to end the toleration of Lutheranism in Germany, and in April 1529, as a response to this action by the Diet of Speyer, 6 German princes and 14 cities actually raised a protest against this oppressive measure of the Diet, defending the freedom of conscience and the right of religious minorities. And that is the reason as to why it is this protest by the German princes and 14 cities of a decision by the Diet of Speyer that earns this movement its epithet, that is Reformation. So, I just alluded to this because this was somewhat interesting, and it would be anachronistic also to use this term Reformation for any and every reforming impulse that were very much there even in 12th, 13th and 14th centuries Europe. So, this is not as if Luther was the first to raise voice or to make it public the need to reform Catholic Church. Even before there were people, but their efforts were not understood as Protestantism because there was another term, evangelicalism, which included those impulses of reforms, and that is how they were conveyed. Now, the Lutheran Reformation is associated with German territories and Luther's time, as you can see on your slide, 1483 to 1546. Luther's personal pervasive influence over German territories is also a critical factor in ensuring success of Reformation movement. Very important or in fact central to his reforms is the issue of the doctrine of justification, and we will see as to what he meant by this. Then if you look at the beginning of Luther's protest or unease with the existing affairs of Catholic Church, then its beginning is not very impressive. It was an academic movement to begin with, which hardly had any social audience outside the University of Wittenberg, and University of Wittenberg itself was not a very you can say very famous of the universities at around that point of time. So, it had a very modest beginning and a very academic beginning. It is only subsequently through his efforts that he generated a lot of excitement about the issue of Reformation, that it became a social movement. And then another landmark you can say in this journey of Reformation is 31st October 1517, where when Luther actually posted the famous 95 Theses, and it is as a kind of his angst against the sale of indulgence, and we will see what the sale of indulgence is. It's like in the medieval times, it had somewhat become a practice in Catholic Church for the priests to basically sell some kind of a certificate to all the adherents of Christianity, which would guarantee them that salvation will happen to them. And originally, if you see, if you look at the history of Christianity, Catholicism, you will find that God would elect someone for salvation in complete disregard to what he or she does in life. So, that is the original tenet with which Christianity had begun, but somewhere in the middle of it, somewhere in the middle of its journey in the Middle Ages, this practice had crept in, which of course on the face of it appears to be a corrupt practice, because the church people and the Pope was making a lot of money out of this sale of indulgence. There were several other practices, like the notion of purgatory, like a place which is like a waiting room for people to be transported to heaven, if not to hell. So it's a position between hell and heaven, and you have that purgatory where people would be given tickets to after death. They would be placed in purgatory, and from there they would eventually go to the heaven, or they would be attaining salvation. So these practices had crept into Catholic Christianity, and church was making a lot of money out of these corrupt practices. And Luther's 95 thesis actually is a response against this practice of sale of indulgence. Then you have the Leipzig disputation. This was sometime around June and July 1519, where Luther confronted the learned and the orthodox Johannes Eck. He questioned the divine appointment of papacy, and also sympathized with Wycliffe and Huss. Now, Wycliffe and Huss are important because they are some of the personalities in the 13th, 14th centuries who had raised the need, who had raised the voice for reform in Catholic Church. And as I said before, that it's not as if Martin Luther was the first to do this, but the critical difference is that while Wycliffe and Huss had only spoken of some of the theological aspects, academic points, as some kind of a plea to reform Catholic Church, Luther was talking at a time in a century where there were several other important political and social groups who latched on to Luther's efforts to leverage their own power, and there was a bigger battle that was being fought between the power of the papacy, the Roman Pope, and the secular monarchs who were emerging in different parts of Europe, aspiring to be as absolutist as possible. So by the time you reach 17th century, you have absolutist monarchs becoming a normative political reality of Europe, and they could not have become so had it not been the movement of Reformation, whereby the Catholic Church practices, its abuses, its corruption would have come under a lot of criticism, and people would have lost faith and reliance on church's capacity. Its power and prestige underwent decline, and at the cost of the declining power and prestige of the Roman Church, you have the emergence of absolutist monarchy. So secular power or kingship actually benefited out of this movement of Reformation against the Catholic Church. So that tells you about some of the antecedents. However, it was only by 1522 that Lutheran reform actually can be said to have begun, because as I told you that in the initial part it was very academic and very restricted and only theological in approach. But ever since or all through the 1520s, it had become, or it had come to excite people in their social and political sense and generate a lot of interest in what Luther was talking. And therefore, when he returned to Wittenberg from his enforced isolation in Wartburg, thereafter his academic reform program actually transforms into a program of reform of church and society. So it's a wider gamut of change that he is championing now. Now, when we talk about Lutheran efforts, there are some questions that we should be answering in order to make a sense of what this was all about, and how there are different social and political trappings of Lutheran revolt. So, the first question is, why to break from Rome? Because Luther was talking about it. He was constantly emphasizing that various kings and princes should actually cut all the existing umbilical ties with Roman Pope, and that was because of a theological issue, and that was justification by faith. Here, what Luther is arguing is that something that I just referred to in terms of a medieval practice, that the earlier pristine conceptualization was that God would very eclectically choose who he wants to redeem, who he wants to salvate. And the clergy, the Pope, the church's bureaucracy had absolutely no role in it. And there is absolutely nothing that you can do in your lifetime to increase your chances of getting selected by God. So it was like God's choice could not be influenced by what you do in your life. So that was the original conceptualization. But in the medieval times, as I told you, that several practices had crept in, which were a source of a lot of scandal and corruption also. And that is what Luther is arguing against. He says that it is just the faith in the scriptures, original scriptures of the faithful of Christianity, that will be of consequence in influencing God's decision to select a person that he wants to salvate, and no other agency can do it. And therefore, he is trying to do away with the intermediary role between God and man that the church has come to acquire during the Middle Ages. So that was what he was talking about. Second, why is it that the Germans rallied to Lutheran cause? Well, the German princes, as I told you earlier, were very supportive of Lutheran efforts, of Lutheran ideas against Catholic Church, and Luther was also very conservative in terms of his appeal to the general masses. And there were several peasant revolts also later in the 1530s, and Luther didn't quite support them because he argued that these German princes are like God's people. They are godly princes, and people should not disobey them. And if you have a movement, a social and religious movement, where the idea that is being transmitted to the wide gamut of society is that they should not vociferously rebel against an existing prince who is a godly prince, who is a godly representative, then it is very conducive ideological surrounding for kingship or for these princes, and therefore there is that sense of religious nationalism that is underpinning the Germans at this point of time in 16th century, and they wanted to sever the ties with Rome and the Pope, and that gave a kind of distinct religious identity to the Germans, to the people that were simultaneously touched by Lutheran revolt. So there is that beginning of national identity in religious terms, in terms of being different from the usual Catholic paraphernalia that characterized the population of Europe elsewhere. Now, why is it that several German princes put Lutheran reforms into effect? These are some of the questions. This is the third question that we need to look into. Well, the answer could be the desire for absolute governmental sovereignty, and I have already spoken about it. What is the symbiotic relation between the German princes and Luther? So, what you have in effect is that the preacher, the populace, and the princes. So, you have Luther, you have common people of Germany under the spell of religious nationalism, you have the princes who are aspiring to become absolutist monarchs. They all are coming together. So, the preacher, the populace, and the prince come together, but with different motives, and that is what accords a lot of success to the movement as a whole. And if we dwell into the first question that we raised, Luther's break with Rome, well, that is argued. Luther spoke of it, the need to break with Rome, and he justified it in terms of the disgust with the contemporary religious abuses. There were several superstitions, there were frauds, there was sale of indulgence, there were corrupt practices. I told you illegitimate sexual, you can say, relations that several clergy had entered into, and this was all coupled with opposition to the medieval Catholic theology, and that is the religion of works itself. So, apart from the existing corrupt practices, you also had a very profound theological reason as to why it is being opposed, and that is, I told you earlier about it, that the religion of works that had come to characterize this issue of salvation was now getting criticized. Now they are trying to go back to the pristine idea where what you work or how you work during your lifetime has absolutely nothing to do with your chances of getting selected by God in salvating you. And so this medieval theology was opposed, and there was this need to oppose this Catholic theology that had crept into Christianity during the medieval times, that is the religion of works, and the attempt was to restore Christianity to its glorious, pristine purity, right? So, here Luther is giving preference to a rigorously Augustinian system of theology which had developed around 400 Common Era, rather than the medieval Thomistic one which was weaved around the religion of works. So, since I have spoken about it, I am not repeating it. And as a kind of summary of it, you can simply understand it in terms of the push for an idea where God alone determined human salvation without disregard to people's merit or works. Hence, the Lutheran doctrine of predestination and justification by faith. So, Lutheran emphasis on predestination and justification by faith is about this. 1517, Pope Leo X proclaimed the sale of indulgence for worldly Albert of Hohenzollern, and this violated Luther's own conviction that people are saved by faith and not works. So, this greatly infuriated Luther, and on October the 31st, 1517, Luther nails a statement of the iconic 95 Thesis that objected to Catholic indulgence doctrine. onto the door of the castle church at Wittenberg. This is an iconic incident. You get to hear of this in all the textbooks that you read about Reformation, and thus began the Protestant Reformation. So, this particular incident is said to have begun, formally begun, as to what we understand by this term Reformation. Of course, this thesis was later translated from Latin to German, which went on to make it all the more popular. I told you earlier about the popularity of printing press that was very critical in spreading the idea and making it more popular. 1519, there is public disputation before the throngs of Leipzig. The Leipzig disputation is what we know as. Luther declared that popes were mere fallible men, and the highest authority for an individual's conscience was the truth of the scripture and scripture alone. So, it is the faith that will be of critical use in increasing your chances of salvation, not other authorities. Pope Leo X charged Luther with heresy, and hence the break with Catholic faith got a justification here. Now, in 1520, Luther published 3 seminal pamphlets outlining what went on to become Lutheran religion, and that is justification by faith, primacy of scripture as opposed to beliefs, practices and accretions that had happened during the Middle Ages, and third is the priesthood of all believers. So, the middlemen are just thrown out of the window so far as God and man relation is concerned. So, a true spiritual state was the congregation of all the faithful, rather a special club of ordained priests. So, this cabal of priests that had come to garner all the worldly benefits out of these practices, that was sought to be done away with. So, these are some of the ideas enunciated by Luther, and this generated lot of excitement amongst the German population. Priests were dubbed as having no supernatural authority. They could be therefore merely called as pastors or ministers. He said no to ecclesiastical hierarchy. He was also in favor of abolishing monasticism, allowed the ministers to marry. Luther himself married in 1525, and thereafter Luther's pamphlets actually was received very well in Germany, and I have earlier already spoken of the symbiotic relation between the German princes and Lutheran theological push. So, that is what accounts for the effort made on part of Martin Luther so far as Reformation in 16th century Europe and Germany in particular is concerned. Thank you.